Want to welcome you all to the Second Sight conversation. This is the final iteration of our series of conversations that are highlighting Medium Photo's Second Sight Award nominees. Today, we're featuring the work of two artists who are nominated for the Second Sight Award, Eric Kunsman and Kathleen Robbins. Both artists were selected from the participants of the 2021 Medium Review through nominations from our participating reviewers. The Second Sight Award is given to one artist annually who will present a lecture at the 2022 Medium Festival of Photography and produce a limited edition fine print for Medium Photo's Group F16 and patron level members. This year, or next year, I should say, we're proud to have Lyle Ashton Harris as our keynote speaker for the festival, and we look forward to announcing additional guest lecturers in the coming weeks. We're recording today's presentation and we'll upload it to our website soon. If you missed the first of either of the two of these conversations that were recorded earlier in September of 2021, I encourage you to visit our website and view each of those artist presentations. They were all excellent. I also wanted to thank Rachel Phillips, who will be monitoring the chat and assisting with Q&A for today's presentation. We are broadcasting to you today from unceded lands of the Kumeyaay people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Diego and Tijuana region. They continue to share their culture, their stories, and their art with all of us for the greater good. And I want to thank the Kumeyaay people for sharing their home with us. So today's program will be led by short presentations by Eric and Kathleen, followed by conversation and questions with Adam Monohon. Adam is an independent scholar and curator of photography. He previously served as the curatorial assistant at the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson and was a graduate curatorial intern at the Getty Museum in the Department of Photographs in Los Angeles, among many other roles in a range of arts institutions other than the two of those. Adam is a graduate of the School of Oriental and African Studies at Pratt Institute. So we'll begin today with the work of Eric Kunsman, who is an artist based in Rochester, New York. Eric is drawn to the tensions of struggling Rust Belt cities in the northeastern United States, attracted to objects left behind, especially those that hint at a unique human narrative. His photographs are revealing a story that was waiting to be told. Eric's current work explores payphones that are operational yet hidden within plain sight throughout the neighborhood near his studio in Rochester. While data suggested that the presence of these payphones might have signified a high crime area, the project has shown Eric something quite different. Eric was nominated for the Second Sight Award by Alex DaCosta, by Ann Kelly, Barbara Tenenbaum, and Jane Yeomans. I'm going to go ahead and give up the screen to Eric. Eric, I'll let you start sharing at your convenience.
All right, keep it going. So first and foremost, thank you, Scott and Rachel and Medium Photo for providing us this opportunity to share our work. As Scott had just mentioned a few moments ago, I live in Rochester, New York, and where my body of work actually comes from is because of my studio. I own a company called Booksmart Studio. We make a lot of fine edition prints for artists, photographers, books, clamshell boxes. This is what my portfolio looks like for this particular body of work. I had to incorporate the white pages. But for 10 years, my studio was about 2 blocks from the Eastman Museum. The building owner passed away. His son put us on a month-to-month, and I could not afford to try to have to move out in 30 days. At first, I was looking neighbor of the arts. This is my studio today, where I'm at. In 2017, luckily, Rochester's real estate is very, very cheap. Otherwise, I could not afford this. Instead of renting someplace, which we did for 10 years, we decided to actually buy a building. And I had a lot of colleagues from RIT will come down to this location. But this is just kind of showing, it's really a combination. I joke about my right side of my brain, which is university arts, my MFAs in book arts and printmaking. And then the left side of my brain is all the geek that comes from RIT and what I teach. So the studio is kind of a culmination of all of those things. But what happened was my old facility, we had 2 galleries and we used to show a lot of exhibitions. We had workshop areas. And when I relocated to this area, a lot of my colleagues at RIT were saying, you know what, it's a war zone there. We can't show at your space. I'm like, number one, I don't have galleries any longer. But we're just doing the printing and the books for individuals. And that labeling is really what threw me off. And my experience was these 3 boys, the first truck I backed up from right to left, it's Harry, Elijah, and Grumpy. They came over and like, Mister, do you need help? And I was like, sure. Grab some of the rolls, take it to the back. Halfway through, they're like, are we gonna get paid? I'm like, guys, I'm moving. I don't have any money. They're like, well, what do you have? And I went through and I'm like, I got coffee mugs. The previous owner had left them. Like, can we pick which one? I'm like, absolutely. But Grumpy, you have to tell me what your name is. He's like, it's Grumpy, mister. I'm like, no, your real name. He goes, look, I've been grumpy since I was 1 because my mother took a lollipop from me and I'm grumpy. I'm like, all right, nice to meet you. But these are the boys, they're the same age as my son. So that knee-jerk reaction of all the neighbors, it's like in the movies you see in the 50s, 60s, everybody was coming over, introducing themselves. So I got to know all the families. So that prejudgment that a lot of my colleagues and friends, because we live in the suburbs, were applying, I was trying to figure out why. And I noticed an abundance of 3 things: corner stores, neighborhood bars, and a lot of payphones. So at first I just started documenting them. They're on the street corners near the studio. It was really about looking at them as a social marker. And I was driving around within 6 square blocks of my studio. There's about 45 of them. And the joke at the time was I had colleagues that would drive with me also, or they would report where they found one. It was kind of payphone hunting at that time. And eventually what happened was I started expanding out to more throughout the Rochester city. And it was really the ones that were outside. And finally, in about 2018, I approached Frontier Communications, which owns all the payphones in Rochester. And they provided me the list of that we have 1,455 of them still in Rochester. So it made it a little bit easier where I could try to get to these places knowing where they were. They're all mapped. I could put, I want to work in this quadrant today. And oftentimes I would have to go back sometimes if the lighting wasn't right. But this is actually right near my studio, this restaurant I pass every day. And the reason why I'm pausing here for a moment is these 2 are very important to me because this is where I started to see that the payphones were still being utilized here in Rochester. And so what started out as just a project about social markers quickly became, wait a minute, people are still using them here. And I didn't realize that at the time. And so I started looking into it a little bit more. More of the data is what I was really interested in. And we'll talk about in a few moments, the project has expanded in other ways. So that's where I started looking at the socioeconomic part of what was actually happening here in Rochester. And it became pretty important. So now that I'm armed with that list from Frontier Communications, I will know the locations. And this was at the brewery here in Rochester. They gave me permission to go through. They were walking me through. They said, well, this one's been removed. I said, I still would like to see it. And just the history of the credit union, the lotto winners, everything that was within this frame. So that's where I've been documenting whether they're there or not. And you'll see in a few moments, I've been resurveying them. This is my neighborhood corner store that I walk to from my studio. This is a scene that's changing daily. And this is one that I came upon. I shoot color film and everything gets converted to black and white because that's what I can process a lot easier either in my studio or at RIT where I teach. And this scene, all my images are black and white because it really helps knock down, the idea of race and class. You don't know as easily which areas are impoverished. And that's where I want to have that level playing field. And this is one of those scenes where this is a 1970s orange, all these sofa chairs are, and the background, the wall is magenta, but I have to keep that level playing field is my goal. With that, the payphones really serve as more of an environmental portrait of the location is really my intention. That's where if there's any individuals in the frame, I tend to make sure that you cannot tell the race or class because I don't want to allow people to label because my neighborhood where my studio is, it's a mix almost equally of Black, Latino, white, and Asian. It's a complete mix. And what I'm afraid of is if I include people, it'll allow people to instantly label it. What I'm also doing, telling the story of the race and economics of Rochester, is resurveying many of the locations. So here's a before and after. So there's a 2-year gap here. And the reason for that is this tells another story. Oftentimes, everything around the payphone is changing, except the actual payphone. This is one of my favorite locations. Well, I can no longer go there. You'll see why in a second. So at first, the barbershop closes, it goes out of business. And I apologize, these are opposite. The one on the right is where the barbershop closes, the payphone's still there. They introduce a slushy store, and for safety reasons, they cut down most of the tree and remove the payphone. So I went into a much deeper dive and I started looking at the census information. And I'll talk about it when it was just displayed at SEPA Gallery in Buffalo. There were many facets to the exhibition. With that, whether it's population density, census, the data. So I started working with people that are smarter than I am. I went to the librarian who's the social sciences and digital humanities librarian, Rebecca Walker and Janelle Didavanoir. And they're the ones that all they do is work with the census data. And we've started working together now for the past 7 months. We state we're still in our infancy, but the idea is to map these. And you'll see the heroin overdoses in Rochester. Yes, it happens in downtown, but it's primarily people driving in from suburbs. And our heroin overdoses in Rochester are 77% white, 14% Latino, and 7% Black. And so trying to get over some of that. This is where at the exhibition in SEPA, we took this data and didn't just have the maps, but we had a walking guide and we had it broken down by zip codes. And all my photographs are labeled by the phone number, address, and the zip code as well. And with that, you can cross compare the data, whether it's poverty, percent of poverty for students or people that are under the age of 18. And so we're trying to give as many facts as possible if people wanted to really look up the information. The title Philosophic Calculus comes from the idea that Frontier Communications is, even though they're in bankruptcy, they're still supporting these where they're used the most. This is in Rochester after Daniel Prude was killed by the Rochester police. This dollar store was looted and I was destroyed because I knew this payphone was used quite a bit, and they also broke the receiver. In 2021, this is in March, the dollar store is back and so is the payphone. Frontier is not making money off this, but they're thinking about something for the greater good of the community. So I'll flip through some of these. And so my project has expanded, not just Rochester, but the entire Monroe County is really what I'm trying to work with the data as well as photograph the different locations. Flip through some. So there's a video documentary, which I'm not showing today. It's 21 minutes long. These talks are supposed to be very fast. So if you're intrigued by this, at the end, I have a QR code, which is a link to, so you can actually see the video documentary that's done up until this point. Of the 1,455 payphones, I have photographed now over 900 of them. And my intention is to get to each of the 1,450 locations, unless I can't get in there like the hospitals or the jail. I'm still trying to get in there. In 2019, I went to Mary Virginia Swanee's masterclass, and she threw a challenge at me, which was the idea of, it's great to have these in galleries and museums, but how are you going to bring it to the public? I'll show you in a few minutes how we did that with the SEPA Gallery exhibition. But for me, one of the biggest things was reaching out to some of the local news media. And so it was run in the free local paper, city newspaper, 2019, some other magazines. But for me, the local free paper was the most important one. And the reason was everybody can grab that newspaper. It was right in front of the Busy Bee, that one restaurant. And Swanee had tried to get me to reach out to Jan Yeomans. And I didn't cold call. That's not my style, unfortunately. But thanks to Medium Photo, Jan and I met and she saw the work. I pulled the article from a different magazine because it wasn't the right fit. And Jan said she wanted to work with it. So in the beginning of September, it was run both online and in print. David Dudley, the writer, drove up from Baltimore. He was checking out all the different payphones. The local media, again, but TV this time, picked it up. And that's how I want to try to get it out to the public, let alone fence installations around Kodak Park and downtown. Rula from Humble Arts Foundation ran an article about the exhibition at SEPA. I'm just going to flip through some more of these, and we're going to look at the SEPA gallery exhibition soon. So this is an example for me that shows, it's not just the payphones. On Instagram now, there's payphoneography at this point, where a lot of individuals are just photographing the phones, and here they are, they're obsolete technology. But to many people, there's still lifelines in Tucson, Portland, New Orleans still has some that are working. People are still relying on these objects. I'm trying to make sure I'm not taking too much time. So again, before and after, telling us more of that story. Again, the idea of the individual. And so as I'm resurveying these, what I'm finding is a lot of the phones or buildings are disappearing. Because I am working with film and the Hasselblad, it opens up a lot of conversations. The best part of this project for me is what I've learned from Rochester and the individuals that come up to me, because they know I'm not a police officer working with the Hasselblad. I've talked to everybody and I've learned so much. This is one in the video documentary. You'll see a funny scene where there's two types of shooting going on. I won't spoil it. I have to get you to want to watch the video documentary somehow. But we're about to get to the SEPA exhibition, and then I will end my talk. There we go. So the exhibition that was held last April through June at SEPA Gallery, it was in all three galleries at their facility. And so the things that beyond my photographs, I had the payphones, which are hacked. And what I've been doing is, rather than me preaching about everybody's story, I'm taking audio interviews of the individuals that I find that are still working or using the payphones. And so a viewer can walk up to the payphone, dialing a number, and hear their stories, their audio. There's no video interviews ever conducted, because I want it to be about their story, not what their race or class is. Another payphone was in the gallery as well, which I was able to talk about my stories and flipping through some of the different installations. So this is what the maps look like for me. I have them where they have to be interactive, because I'm afraid everybody just walks by maps, and unless you engage with it, I joke with my students that everybody has ADD or ADHD, and you can see the key is blocked out in the bottom right-hand corner. And on the wooden dowel, it says, please pull the map. It's like an old school map, so you can look at the relationship of the data. The other part was the payphones for the audio. And for me, another way to engage the community was, it won't always be this in every exhibition, but at SEPA, there were enough remnants of payphones in Buffalo. So we invited the Buffalo community to go out and photograph their payphones, and they would submit them. It was called Buffalo Payphoneography. Fuji sponsored it. They donated 3 cameras. I donated some exhibition prints. This is showing you engagement with people. Actually, even during COVID, we had the wipes on top of phone books. They would wipe it down before they would actually use the phone, and quite a few people interacted with it. I'll get to the Buffalo Payphoneography in a second, but there was an exhibition catalog and this data guide, which is at the end, I'll have a QR code that this is also available for purchase. The book, there's an introduction from Benjamin Hickey, or he wrote the foreword, and Allison Nordstrom wrote the introduction. We invited a gentleman from Los Angeles. I flew him out. He goes by Screwy Blooms on Instagram. And we went through Buffalo, and he makes installation art out of abandoned where there's no payphone left in it. And here you could see he treated Buffalo to a Buffalo Bills Mafia scene. But this is the Buffalo Payphoneography. So individuals submitted their files. We printed every submission, 8x10, dye sublimation, and they became part of the exhibition through the annex. And we had over 600 submissions. On the closing, we passed out the awards. Each person that works at SEPA was able to pick their favorite. And that's how we handed out the 6 different prizes that were available. But we took that data, and to try to hit home for everybody, the data they collected by submitting their files, we took that and we mapped it with the census information for Buffalo. So it wasn't just about, here's a Rochester project. How do we get it to relate to where the actual gallery is located? And here's where you can see that. And the last thing I'll show you really quickly is I have a side project, which is lifelines throughout the United States. The reason why I started this project is I don't want to be putting down Rochester, that look how poor we are. And this is why we still have payphones. There's many other locations throughout the United States. These two in California at Muir Woods and Point Reyes Station still worked. This one in New Orleans at the time worked. This did not. So that's why I'm branching out whenever I go to portfolio reviews or have exhibitions. This is when I was actually down at Swanee's Masterclass. This is Hotel McCoy in Tucson. And here are those QR codes, and I will stop talking now.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
I have a number of questions for you, but to just like piggyback on your last point about photographing payphones in other locations, I've maybe two related questions. How, when you're out of Rochester, do you go about finding payphones? And then could you also talk about sort of your process for resurveying payphones in Rochester? Are you re-photographing everything that you've photographed, or have you identified sort of like a narrower subset through some criteria?
It's really because I find myself driving around Rochester quite a bit. My wife works for the Rochester School District, so I will visit different schools. But it's really about, the best part for me is I've learned more about Rochester, and I go to parts that a lot of other people are scared of. But with finding the payphones now, Frontier Communications literally gave me their list. So this will actually tell me where it is, even within the building. So it's kind of cheating in a way that I have, but it's no longer payphone hunting. But now I know where they're located in the spaces. When I go to other cities, that is still more or less payphone hunting and observing different locations. And something that's happened is now I have a lot of friends, colleagues. I get a lot of texts. Here's a payphone. Okay, give me the location in case I'm ever in the city. So I've started a database knowing where other ones are located.
Mm-hmm.
So, but for me, the exhibitions, the one in Muir Woods, my daughter, when she was 5, we were going in the shuttle and she saw it before I did. And she yells out payphone, and all the adults on the bus turn around and look like, what's going on? She gets off, skips over to it, picks it up and says it works. And all the adults, like a candid camera moment was going on or something. So, so I've helped.
Great. And with the Buffalo payphonography, I had wanted to ask you, were you sort of asking that people follow your process in a way of like collecting data, noting where things are, or it sort of sounds like you encourage like digital files to be submitted so that data could then be extracted, or how did that work?
Some people actually scanned film and sent them to us.
Oh, really?
There was only one requirement, is they could photograph them with their iPhone. They could do anything, but they had to provide us either the address or the cross streets.
Okay.
They didn't realize we were going to map them. And that's where, whenever I show this in the future, it won't always be payphones. When I was meeting with different individuals, I say, you know, in Denver, it's about the unpaved alleys. I'd want to work with each curator or even a professor at a local university and try to get them involved. So that was really the main thing, was they didn't have to follow my formula. In fact, most people had no idea about my project. It was blasting it in the media. And so that was the best part, was the engagement. And what we were able to see is, why did this payphone show up 25 times where this one showed up once? And once you overlay the census data, you can start to see some of those correlations. And that's what we talked about at the closing.
What are those correlations? I imagine people doing this sort of like payphonography are not necessarily people using payphones.
No, that's where now on Instagram, like that payphonography, it's just a hashtag that's being used. There's somebody on here right now, Ryan Stephen Green. He's Los Angeles Payphones. He does a lot more with before and afters. So I work with a lot of the other people on social media that are about telling the story, not just, oh, look what I found. And that's what's important for me, I guess you'd say.
Eric, there's a question in the chat about how the project has shaped you as an artist. And I think if I can read between the lines there, you know, it's clear how this has shaped you as a human, because you've talked about your engagement with the community. But I'm assuming the question is a little bit more just the creative side. Are you thinking more of, you know, a typology type approach to your work, or, you know, how has it shaped you as an artist?
Really not the typology, because I don't want you to, even though there is a comparison and contrast, I really want you to go back to the data. So this is really new for me. So where it's kind of shaped me as an artist, and as you said, as a human being now, is number one, I've learned so much more about Rochester, but really it's about mapping that and really calling people to think about their prejudgment in some of these locations. And yes, it's nice talking to artists and the galleries. Like in December, I'm going to talk at the Eastman Museum. Most of those, I'm prejudging myself right now, but most of those people will never have been to most of the locations that I'm going into and photographing. So my call is, when you get out, don't just lock your car doors as you're driving through these areas. And that's what I'm really calling into question. It's many of my friends, I hate to say it, you know, they might come here and be like, oh, I don't want to get out of the car, I'm scared. There's kids running around this neighborhood, and it's just that prejudgment. That's where I'd say it's shaped me as an artist, that I'm not just thinking about my photography, I'm thinking about the broader picture.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I will go ahead and advance the conversation now to the work of Kathleen Robbins. Go ahead and share the screen. Kathleen is an artist who's based in Columbia, South Carolina, where she's a professor of art and coordinator of the photography program and the affiliate faculty of Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina. As a photographer, her work examines the intersection of memory, grief, and our physical relationship with the natural world. Her photographs have been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions, including the New Orleans Photo Alliance, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, Addison Gallery of American Art, the Southeast Museum of Photography, the Mississippi Museum of Art, and a long list of others. Her work has been featured by the CNN Photo Blog, Flack Photo, Fraction Magazine, Conscientious, Humble Arts Foundation, and many more. Kathleen was the recipient of the Photonola Review Prize for her project Into the Flatland, which was published as a monograph in 2015. Kathleen was nominated by Jacqueline Bates from California Sunday, Ashley Lum, David Orsick, Mary Statzer, and Jane Yeomans. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to Kathleen Robbins. Welcome.
Thank you, Scott. I'll go ahead and share my screen. First off, I'd like to say how much I enjoyed Eric's talk. Thanks for sharing your work. We use very similar tools, Eric, so I was really interested in that. I've been shooting with a Hasselblad super wide for a long time, and most of my work is for this series is also shot with a Hasselblad. So I want to thank Scott and Medium for inviting me to share work tonight. I'm delighted to be here with Eric and Adam, and thank you to the reviewers who nominated me for the Second Sight Award. I'll share work from an ongoing series of photographs that mostly came about in 2019, though I made a few images in 2018 as well. The work began after the unexpected death of my husband, Ben. The photographs are not linear and move between outdoor travel, my family's farm in Mississippi, where we sought refuge, and in 2020, we returned home. There are women in my family who have similarly had the earth pulled from under them and somehow survived. My great-grandmother lost her husband at the age of 32. She was left to raise their 5 young children, but mostly I think of her daughter, my late grandmother, and she was a painter. I often consider my loss in relation to hers. I look to her writing, her Polaroids, home movies as a point of connection. The pairing illustrates a mutual experience divided in time and space. Following the death of her husband in 1985, my grandmother wrote, "The ginkgo tree is in its golden glory today, after a period of November and a brief blaze of color, it loses its leaves quickly, dropping them in a gold circle-like carpet almost within an hour's time. Like life, one barely has time to appreciate the beauty before it's gone. We are so fragile. After my husband died, I felt unmoored and looked to nature for escape and solace. I marked time through photographs as we traveled through public parks and spaces rich with our own history, including the land where my grandmother recorded her feelings of loss years prior. The photographs function as articulations of mourning. Before he died, Ben and I planned a tour of the national parks together with our son. Ben was turning 50, I was due for a sabbatical, and we were both feeling world weary. He passed away a few days shy of our planned departure. And several months later, my son and I decided to attempt a version of that trip. We traveled to escape the familiar routine of our house. And while it felt like running away, it also allowed us to feel tethered to something again. The travel provided a thread or a map to navigate the days and months ahead. To make sense of things, I also turned to books. A grief memoir that I relied heavily upon, The Curve of Time, was written by Muriel Blanchett, who was widowed in 1927. Following her husband's death, she spent summers traveling the waters of British Columbia in a small boat with her 5 children. She describes the sensation of seeing oneself as outside of time after suffering a loss. Standing in the present on the highest point of the curve, she said, you can look back and see the past, or forward and see the future, all in the same instant. Or if you stand off to one side of the curve, as I am doing, your eye wanders from one to the other without any distinction. And this was my experience for a long time in the beginning of loss, was thinking of our experience in terms of past and present and future, and constantly reconciling where we were on that curve. None of the photographs exist discreetly in isolation. Rather, like Bergson's conception of temporality, they blur. I was interested in the notion that we were seeking something in these experiences. So often the image is obscured by the atmosphere, or there's motion in the distance. One of the things that is typical with grief is becoming fixated on finding meaning. And for me, one obsession early on was thinking about my late grandmother's last paintings as a parallel for our experience. Late in life, my grandmother replicated her watercolor paintings using the glass surface of her framed archive as a substrate. Suffering from dementia, she traced the details of the once familiar landscape of our family farm, depicted in the pieces beneath, only to wipe away the paint upon finishing. She lost the ability to speak, and I can't say for certain, but in hindsight, it seemed that this repetitive act of creation might have been a way for her to ignite her memory and reconcile her existence in place and time after her husband died. I ruminated on this ritual of hers and imagined my son and I as inhabiting one of those temporary glass surface paintings. We were so fragile, and it was as though we existed in an in-between place. I had all but given up on sleep at home, but somehow we both slept more soundly in a tent. We spent a combined 3 weeks sleeping outside in 2019, and rafting the Green River in Utah just after the 1-year anniversary. I thought about the forces of time and erosion and memory. There is a height chart by my son's bed. And at night, I glance over and I note how tall he was when his dad died. He was really tiny. Time moves on, time stands still. And I felt like I understood on a metaphysical level how the canyons we floated by in Utah and Colorado were shaped and twisted, but accepting platitudes and melancholy as part of the beauty of life is a challenge. It was several months before I felt comfortable leaving our house. In this photograph, the image on the left is Yellowstone. The image on the right is a science project that was begun at the beginning of quarantine. And I felt it was several months before we felt comfortable leaving the house. And then when we were forced back home in 2020, it felt like early grief. It was very reminiscent of that early period. And this is an image of my son's last baby tooth. One of the interesting things about, children when they're losing teeth when they're really little is that's a frightening experience. But then when they get older, they're like really comfortable. And he ripped his tooth out and got the gauze. He was 12 at this point. And so I came, or 11, he was 11, but I came upon this scene in the breakfast nook. And this is the ginkgo tree in our backyard. When my husband and I first toured our house in South Carolina before our son was born, we were charmed by the small ginkgo tree in our backyard, which reminded us of my grandmother's tree. And then that's her Polaroid there on the right. And this is a cyanotype during quarantine. And this is Asher with my brother's dog, Birdie. When I sent this film to the lab, I sent it in with a roll of film that had been sitting in a jar in my studio for about 10 years, and I didn't know what was on it. And when they both came back, the other roll of film included images of Ben that I didn't remember taking. And they were also taken on the farm with our dog. In the same landscape, and they were shot 10 years apart to the day. I was pregnant with Asher when I'd taken those images. So that was an unusual find. And I'll leave you with this image, which I made with Ben in 2018. This was a few days before he died, actually. We were on vacation with my in-laws in the low country of South Carolina, and he and I went for a walk on the beach. This was following Hurricane Matthew, which caused significant damage to this particular barrier island. And so we walked together on the beach and made this photograph. C.S. Lewis wrote that there existed a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. Grieving people can become estranged misfits, but we're living in a time of collective grief. And so that's one of the things that I was interested in this work, and I hope that it lifts the veil a bit. And when I signed up for reviews last spring, I was really just looking for a space to work some of that out and to think about ways to remove the emotion from the work when I talked about it. I had been making in relative isolation, and the conversations really helped me to understand what parts of the work were confusing and which parts push buttons. And anyway, it definitely moved me toward ideas. So thank you. And that's all I have. So I'll stop my share, I think.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you. This is my first time seeing the work since we didn't have an opportunity to chat at Medium. That's super beautiful and profound, and I feel like it so sort of deftly deals with things that I think that so many people don't really like dive as deeply into as you. There's sort of emotions that most humans avoid or don't have sort of the tools to deal with, and it's just really beautiful the way you're exploring and like probing all of these things. Some questions that come up for me is just, I like find your inclusion of Polaroids to be very interesting and something that you didn't remark on initially. And I was wondering if you could sort of tell us more about your process with those Polaroids. Are those sort of like pairings that are happening after the fact, or things that you're actually thinking about while shooting? Or
yeah, so I sort of glossed over that a little. Those are my grandmother's. So my grandmother lived on our family's farm for 60 years, and she was an artist. I was very close to her, and her Polaroids were studies for paintings. So those were her photographs, and for the last 3 years, I've really looked at her writing and her photographs and her home movies as points of connection.
And so when we're seeing these pairs, they're sort of happening after the fact?
So yeah, they absolutely happen, in sequencing, and thinking about time, right? And thinking about how when you are in the thick of grief, you're constantly trying to reconcile where you are in time. And so I've thought a lot about her loss and how she handled that. And yeah, I don't know. It's sort of important, I think, when you're experiencing grief to have people to look to, and to consider how other people have navigated their experience. And so for me, it has been her.
It's really, I mean, it's both interesting and it seems really lucky to have her as a figure. She seems like a very sort of like complex and thoughtful person. And I mean, it's interesting to me too, I suppose, that you seem to have like a really important relationship with various texts in your work. You like mediate your work through text, and it's, I mean, I think that happens a lot. People do that, and you're referencing these sort of other writers, but you're also referencing your grandmother's writing, which I think is very interesting, both to have that sort of like, in a way, like linear influence, and then the external influence of other artists. It's all, I mean, it's all very sort of poetic and profound and lovely. I had another question about pairing, which was that image of, I think it's a geyser at, is it Yellowstone?
Yes.
With the sort of science project. Could you maybe like dive deeper into how that pairing is operating?
Yes. So, I could talk a little about the table for one, and then how that connects. So, the table belonged to my husband's grandfather, and for a while, or in early grief, it was really difficult for me to cook or to sit and eat at a table. So we ate like savages over the sink, and then it was just too hard. And so I remembered that there was this table in the attic, and this round table, and it occurred to me that the two of us could sit at that table and it would be easier. So I pulled it out of the attic, and that table has become really the center of our life in our house. And so it also is a place where I photograph a lot. But the science project sat on the table for, 3 months, I think. And so it became just this funk in jars, right? But initially it was meant to be a science project about climate change. And throughout the photographing of this project, one of the threads for me has been thinking about climate change as a metaphor for grief. And before we actually entered into the trip that we took, but we were planning a different trip with my husband, and the photographs I imagine taking on that trip were also about grief. The world was really grieving already, and so climate change sort of has been in the back. And so the image from Yellowstone, that early trip, I'm interested in this idea that that can become sort of a black hole too, right? And it just sort of felt like these landscapes, particularly that one, some of them were very dangerous, and we felt so like temporal. And so it feels like something you could fall into, right? And I think that the exercise on the table is also about the end of things, right? It's about finality.
Beautiful. Could you, I think one last question, and maybe we can turn to any audience questions, but could you just elaborate on what you mean by climate change as a metaphor for grief?
So I think there's a photograph, the last photograph from the beach, of the house that's sitting on the beach. That house was left after Hurricane Matthew. And I mean, you know, one of the visible ways in which climate change has manifested here in South Carolina is that the seas are rising, right? So so the coastline has really changed, and that particular beach is the one where we vacation every year. And so, gosh, there's no short answer for this question, but so when we walked on the beach that day, it was, we made that photograph together, really, and had a conversation about that image and what it meant. And, you know, one of the things that we would consider in talking to Asher while we were traveling was what we were seeing and how it might be changing in terms of the landscape, and then how that was reflected in other ways. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that answered that question at all, but I think it's really in that image for me because, yeah, I don't know, it represented so much more.
Well, I want to thank you, you both, Adam and Kathleen, for navigating us through this really wonderful body of work, and really personal, with layers that I don't think most viewers would be quick to bring to it. And it's incredibly courageous, Kathleen, and wonderful to share. In keeping with our promise to maintain a short event, I think it would be a good time to go ahead and conclude this now, but I wanted to again thank both of you, and thank Eric as well, and all of the participants who were able to join us today. This is the conclusion of the 3 of our second site conversations. The first 2 have been posted to Medium Photo's website, and this one will be posted as well shortly. So I wanted to close with that, and with a hearty round of thanks for all of you. This has really been a wonderful, wonderful event.